Hello and welcome to Just for Us, the show that talks about justice issues facing the world. I'm your host, Nico DMT, and let's dive into the deep end, shall we? Today we're talking about food and transit deserts. For those of you who don't know, food deserts are areas within a city in which residents don't live within close, decent proximity to a grocery store. The USDA has actually strict guidelines that we will follow when discussing food deserts, and there'll be two main points, which will show up on screen now. To begin, we'll look at two different examples that are cities that I have chosen that I know pretty well. So we're going to start with food deserts and then move on to transit deserts. And we're going to talk about food deserts first, since it is typically the most complicated and the most important when talking about specifically deserts and other things like that, and food apartheid. You can see both Houston and DC. Food deserts are concentrated in communities of color or POC neighborhoods, and DC, basically all the food deserts are in majority black neighborhoods. Where in Houston, since Houston is a little bit more diverse, Houston has most of these food deserts in black and Latino neighborhoods. This is part of the built environment that I was talking about that has affected of color like Latino, Asian, Native American, or other immigrant groups. And it wasn't really fact, right? It would just give these letter grade, and typically the red areas received an F, and they were the only neighborhoods that black people could afford to live in, and some other people not just could afford to live in, but could legally live in at the time, right? And even if I mentioned earlier in my research that even if black people could afford to move to an expensive neighborhood, up until 1965, many neighborhoods, specifically in the South and even in the North, but especially suburbs, were white only. So you had to be white. So what these neighborhoods did is that they built up wealth in white neighborhoods and helped prioritize that resources were often concentrated there, and that made sure that a lot of grocery stores did not prioritize black or other communities of color, which is crazy because we all need to eat, right? So many grocery stores believed that they could make a higher profit in higher income neighborhoods, which, because of redlining we mentioned earlier, happened to be predominantly white. This discrepancy in grocery store location has actually created ginormous disparities between neighborhoods. There have been many reports of residents traveling 2 to 3 hours for just groceries, which is absolutely insane to me, a basic necessity that we all need. Anyway, much of this does have to do with, again, like I mentioned, the lack of proximity to grocery stores, but also the lack of effective and efficient public transportation to take these residents there, right? Again, this is just a band-aid, right? I would love personally, and what the government needs to do is make sure that fresh, cheap, and healthy options are available no matter your neighborhood, but transit could fill the gaps if it was reliable. So what I'm getting at is living in a transit and food desert is a double curse that millions of residents who are predominantly black, and also other people of color, but predominantly black, have seen throughout the US and continue to face in 2026, which is absolutely insane. I'm also shocked that more people in general haven't talked about the link between these two things, and how often, because these grocery stores are so far away, people are losing money just needing basic necessities, which creates more wealth lost, and less wealth created in black and POC neighborhoods. So I mentioned wealth lost, right? So what is actually really the cost of living in a food or transit desert? I think that's something that really fascinates me as someone who is interested in kind of finance and economics, right? We always say a lot of right wing people will always say, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. Like, my great grandfather came here with 2 pennies and a dream and he made it happen. But I'm going to show you that now and even back then, it was very unrealistic, especially for black folks and other people of color, right? So the overall cost of food deserts and transit deserts are plentiful, but there's a bunch of buckets that they fall into that make the cost kind of compound and make it exponential, right? So we're only going to talk about three, but there could probably be so many more, and there's probably so much more research on this, right? So we're going to talk about health, time, and financial. Speaking of public transit, there was one study set that suggests, on average, overall, not in some of the better metros for public transit, but just average overall, suggests that taking public transit to the grocery store can triple the time it gets there. And honestly, I'm shocked it's not more, but it's still sad to see that it's that low. So let's say closest grocery store is a 20-minute drive one way, which for millions of Americans is absolutely true and the only grocery store that they can access. On public transit, that trip would take an entire hour one way. So round trip, that would take 2 hours, which in a car would be a 40-minute trip, right? So again, it's kind of insane that many millions of people are living like this, right? So again, there's also a patchwork of reliability of public transit in this country. So you can even assume that it takes even longer in some other places, especially places that don't even have, buses or, buses that come every hour or anything like that. So many people, for example, in Houston, which is a very more car dependent city than DC or anywhere in DC, many people in Houston don't have their own car and often either rely on others or carpool or public transit. For example, in Harris County, which is the county that Houston is in, around 7 people or 330,000 people don't have a car in their household, while 92,600 people or 2% of the county consistently rely on public transportation for work and errands, right? So that is a big percentage of people in one county. Yes, it is the third biggest, but it's still a lot of people that rely on public transit for simple errands, right? And often this varies directly on income level. So low income communities rely on public transit way more often than wealthier communities, which, surprise, surprise, is not a surprise to me. And the data was not uniform around different cities, but lower income people in general depend on public transit more often than wealthier people. Just want to put that out there. It does make sense, but that is backed up by studies. For example, in Houston, nearly 7% of people below the poverty line rely on public transportation every day to go to work, compared to 2.5% of people above the poverty line, right? So there is a big discrepancy between people who use public transit and people who don't. So in DC, you're able to get a clearer picture on income levels specifically, so not just if you're above or below the poverty line. It seems that the higher someone's income is, the less likely they'll be relying on buses for work. For example, 12% of people below the poverty line require the bus, and the public transportation decreases unilaterally as incomes rise. And there will be a graphic following along, so you can see that as well. So this is important for our case study and kind of example that we're going to do, right? I'm giving you all this background information because you'll be able to get the implications about food deserts and how increasing transit can actually help fill the gaps. Again, this is not a long-term solution, but it's something that can fill in the gaps within these communities so that they're able to get to grocery stores faster that are not in these communities. We do need to focus on investing in these communities for grocery stores in general, though. far different things are, and one of the worst food apartheid slash food deserts within the country. And I'm going to use an apartment building within that. This is also assuming, and this is like the best time that I could find, that you can walk to. So it's assuming that this person who is doing this is able-bodied, which is a whole nother topic we will probably get into later. But it takes around 35 minutes, and the bus only comes every 2 minutes. And you also need to make sure that you're lining up your transfers correctly, and you need to make sure you leave at a very specific time to make sure those transfers line up correctly, so you're not waiting more than you normally do. So that is a lot. I assume that's a lot, right? Because it is. It really is. Next slide, or next picture I'm going to show you, is if you just walk, right? Walking on Google also tends to, depending on your walking speed, either over or underestimate. So this may vary. Walking in Houston is not great. I've done it before in, some nicer neighborhoods that have better sidewalks, and it still is not that fun. And it would take close to an hour to walk to the grocery store, which for people who don't have a car, people who rely on public transportation, right, is a lot. Because if you miss the bus, or you're not, you can't get to the grocery store when it's on peak hours, this is how far it would take you. So it would take you nearly 2 hours walking, and many people are not in a physical condition to be able to do that, whether that be for a variety of different reasons, right? The next case study we have is DC's, right? Again, it varies on where you are, but I was able to see that it only took one bus and a couple minutes of walking, both ways, to get to a grocery store, right? Which is a lot better. It's not maybe the best, but it takes around 20 minutes, right? And the bus, if you look at the frequency, is a lot better on peak than it is in Houston, right? And you don't have to transfer. You don't have to worry about that, right? So that is a huge, huge benefit for someone that relies on public transit, right? That's 20 minutes, and we're going to calculate the time and how much you would save with that 20 minutes if you're working. So that's something that is very beneficial to have that more frequent transit. The walking, it takes, a good almost 15 to 20 minutes less to walk to the grocery store, right? And I mean, I couldn't do like a Google Street, I could do a Google Street View, but I'm not sure how much better the walk would be, but I know it would take less time and make it easier for people to get the food that they need to feed their families, which is extremely important. Now we're going to go into how time, income, and health play into all of these things we talked about in relation to access to grocery stores. For example, we know high income people are closer to grocery stores. They spend around 101 minutes prepping and shopping for food, whereas low income people or lower income people typically spend 129 minutes on the day-to-day prepping and shopping. So if we do some calculations and kind of put this into every day and kind of assume that that is the average for each bucket, we can get some numbers, and my calculations will be linked in the bio. And there's a lot of different math, but the difference is 28 minutes. We times that by the amount of days, and then we get the amount of minutes, and then per year, actually what was calculated is that almost a week or 7 days of a year is the delta or the difference between a high or low income person shopping versus a high income person. So a low income person typically has to spend a week more of their life just shopping and prepping for food. And mind you, that's just shopping. And this may not sound like a lot, but in a capitalist society, which we live in, time is money, unfortunately. And so this is just, like I mentioned, 1 year. So we could expand this gap into the average person's working life, which is around 45 years, and the gap widens even more considerably. And we're also, again, because we live in a capitalist society, I am going to um, do it by basically monetary value. And of course, time wise, like time is precious, but seeing it monetarily, I feel like really drives home the impact and shows how much is lost just by existing as a low income person. And most of these places where the discrepancies are within Black and Latino neighborhoods. So the time difference also bleeds into the different financial aspects. And we're going to take the time and use it by times that by the minimum wage. Of course, someone could be making more or making less, hopefully not less, but there is always that case. So in DC, the minimum wage is $17.95. On Houston, it is $7.25. And we can also see that, like, per year, you can calculate how much a week would be paid, and you can see in DC it is around $650, and in Houston it is $268 that you're losing out per year. But if you're able to times it by around 45, which is the amount of typical years in a working person's life, you get what is on this slide, and there is a lot you can see within it. And the big thing that I'm going to highlight is the lost wages, right, in Houston and DC. You can see that specifically these lost wages equal a person's wages for the entire year. So someone, based on just food shopping and food prepping alone, and the difference of food shopping and food prepping alone, loses a year of income within a life, right? A whole year just on this one little thing that they do that is essential to maintain life, right? And I think that's something that is horrible and something that we as a society need to do better to make sure that this does not happen and this difference basically gets reduced and hopefully eventually eliminated. So there was one study that showed that specifically income and health food accessibility were actually associated with life expectancy at birth. So for example, someone who was born in a high income, high access neighborhood to healthy foods had an average life expectancy of around 80, whereas someone high income but low access to healthy foods was a year lower, so around 79, whereas low income, high access was 77, approximately 77, whereas the worst was low income and low access to healthy foods, which was 75 years. So what this gap means is that there's a nearly 5-year gap between the wealthiest and low access to healthy food counties, right? And specifically, even within similar income census tracts, it seems that high access to grocery stores is contributed and correlated with higher life expectancy and quality of life, further emphasizing the need for this within our everyday lives. Between low income and high access and low income and low access, there's around a 2-year increase or decrease depending on when you're doing it. There is a tangible health benefit, as we have seen, between increasing the access to grocery stores and especially fresh produce. I think that's something important because many politicians, even on both sides of the aisle, can sometimes accuse low-income people of eating too much junk food, of spending too much money on X, Y, and Z. But the reason is that it's built into their environment, especially in Black and Latino neighborhoods throughout the United States, right? They don't have access to fresh and healthy foods within their communities, and best place, or typically the only place that they can go, are these fast food places that these politicians often get mad at these communities for going to. The 2-year gap that I mentioned between these low income communities based on their access, right, is a lot. That's a lot of lives being changed because of their access or lack thereof of these certain high quality stores. And not even high quality, just basic grocery stores, right? And there's a lot of different things that we can do to improve the gaps. And that's what I'm going to get into next. So improving grocery store locations is the number one priority when trying to tackle this, specifically in Black and Latino areas, because those are typically the areas that were and are hit hardest by food deserts. And that is typically an intentional design, as I mentioned kind of in our history section. And the grocery store should be close to these communities as well, to make sure that they are within walking distance, because many of these communities don't have access to either reliable public transportation or to private vehicles that they could easily go into. Second, which is important for a variety of different reasons, but for this as well, is increasing transit, particularly bus transit frequency, and improving and increasing locations. So this is so people can get to grocery stores more quickly and easier. And this would be kind of maybe the first step to doing this, and is typically a lot easier than just building a bunch of grocery stores, but nonetheless still important. And residents can also shop around for the best deals as well. That I thought would be important is incentivizing farmers markets, community gardens, and cooking skills within communities. This could happen at schools, at like local community spots, or even like churches or other things like that. Basically community centers. Specifically, I'm thinking of the gardening or farmers market. And the cooking skills within communities would be important to teach in school or in other places where a lot of young people gather. And school is like one of the best places to teach younger generations about healthier eating habits and how to access these foods, especially considering that they are not within these communities. And farmers markets could help bridge the gap, specifically within schools, and gardening or community gardens could do that as well. And this is something that is more difficult to put in place nationwide, but it's something that could help the residents and help build community within these communities as well. And there's actually a lot of different organizations doing that. They should be in the link, not the link, but in the bio as well. I'll put some examples of that, because even though I'm not doing the work, I want to try to highlight as many people doing the work as possible. Volunteering and community building is one of the best things that you can do. And also make sure that you are listening, and if you're joining something new, to listen to the people that came before you, because they are the ones that have paved the way and are doing the work. If you're able to do this, even something small as attending 1 or 2 protests, or even donating some money to an NGO, you can be part of a future where, regardless of zip code, access to grocery stores and healthy food does not determine your future nor your fate. If you liked this video, make sure you like and subscribe and share with a friend so the algorithm can recommend it to more people. Hope you have a great day, and make sure that you fight just for us. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.